this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Welcome to the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace, and joining me today is Matthew Hough. Now, last month we were down to record a live episode of the podcast at the Imperial War Museum, but at the last minute the IWM postponed the event. As Matthew and I were all prepared to discuss Harold Alexander and his road to supreme command, we thought we might as well have our chat anyway and record it. Matthew is a postgraduate researcher at the University of Leeds whose research focuses on Harold Alexander and ideas around supreme command in the Mediterranean theatre toward the end of the war. Thanks for joining me, Matthew. So, if we are going to look at Harold Alexander and his road to supreme command, we should perhaps start with who Alex was. What shaped him? I assume he must have seen action during the First World War.
He has, I suppose you could say, a good First World War, if that's a phrase you can use. He was involved in pretty much, like a checklist of major battles on the Western Front. He was with the Irish Guards, wounded twice, fought at the Battle of Loos, Somme, Cambrai. Interestingly, what I think marks him out as different from a lot of his colleagues later on is that during the First World War, at no point was he in any kind of staff role. He was constantly leading from the front and seems to have been very good at it, and was singled out for praise in the regimental history of the Irish Guards by Rudyard Kipling, whose son was a fellow officer. By the end of the war, at about the age of 27, he was a lieutenant colonel and was in temporary command of a brigade in 1918. So he'd clearly kind of excelled in this role of, leading in the trenches.
It's quite a remarkable war service from 1914 sort of all the way through, because a lot of people join a bit later or they get injured and then get a different job, but he's there all the way through. What is also interesting, at the end of the war, it's not like he's had enough. He comes back for more, but this is perhaps his first taste of coalition in the Baltic.
Yeah, he ends up through a contact, a sort of fellow Irish Guardsman. He initially goes to Poland to sort of work for this kind of civilian mission there, and ends up kind of transferring to Latvia. The Latvian War of Independence is going on, which is a sort of spin-off conflict, if you like, from the Russian Civil War, where there's the Bolsheviks fighting against the native Lets and also the German, sort of ethnic German militias called the Baltische Landeswehr, who are made up of basically German-speaking soldiers who've basically just been in the German army in the First World War, and they've got all the same kit and a lot of the same leaders. And Alexander's initially attached to them as a kind of advisor. Eventually, the general in command is deemed to be politically unreliable because he's got sort of ambitions to kind of rekindle the German Empire in the East. So he's removed, and Alexander, who's about 28, ends up being put in command of this sort of brigade of German-speaking troops, and he spoke German, and he was very well respected by these guys. He was wounded again, this time by one of his own sentries, accidentally, but he seems to have kind of again excelled, and he would later sort of encounter some of the German officers he'd worked with. He would recognize in sort of reconnaissance photos in North Africa on the other side. He knew them all. I think I'm right in saying he was the only British, or certainly one of the only Allied generals to have ever commanded German troops in battle.
So he's Staff College in 1926, which is presumably that's quite late in his career. But Staff College is often formative for many of these British officers because they start to bump into people who will then they'll be working with during the Second World War. These connections start to be made. What's his experience at Staff College? Is he a natural?
No, not at all. He's much older than his colleagues, his sort of the rest of his intake. He's at this point in his mid-30s, and he's a full colonel, so he has to take a temporary demotion to major so that he doesn't outrank the instructors. At the time, you've got the director of studies is Alan Brooke, who would later become the chief of the Imperial General Staff. And one of the instructors teaching Alexander is the future Field Marshal Montgomery. And it's safe to say that I think Alexander is not a natural student. He's not especially academic. He is far more practical, but was held in very high esteem by his fellow students who kind of all looked up to him because he's got, this kind of wealth of experience leading at every level from sort of lieutenant up to lieutenant colonel at this point. And he's sort of senior to them both in rank and experience. Interestingly, there's one particular kind of exercise that stands out from his time at Staff College where in sort of syndicates, they were called, these kind of groups they had to operate in, they were told to sort of envisage a war in 1942 and what the conditions might be like. And they didn't get everything spot on, but Alexander's syndicate notably did predict that the British would most likely be fighting with an external partner from outside the empire and that would be impacting the way things were run. So that's noteworthy in view of his later role as a coalition commander in Africa and Italy.
I wonder if he was thinking that external partner would be France or if he was thinking it would be the US. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. But
you mentioned Alan Brooke. Alex is with the BAF in 1940, and in some respects, Alan Brooke's a corps commander, isn't he, in 1940? I tend to think that some people fall onto Alan Brooke's radar as part of the BAF. What was Alex's BAF experience in France 1940? Does he drop onto Alan Brooke's radar?
He does, yeah. He's commanding the 1st Division, which is initially in one corps, which is under General Michael Barker, but at various points transfers to 2 corps and sort of back and forth. So he's in Alan Brooke's orbit. Initially, Alan Brooke he's quite a harsh judge of character and very quick to form judgments and stick to them. And another one of the divisional commanders in 1940, Harold Franklin, later said in an interview that when Alan Brooke sort of encountered Alexander for the first time pretty much since Staff College in the 1920s, he would talk about him in the same terms he had done then. He's got no brains, he's useless. But having seen him in combat, leading the division, which he did very well, he sort of obviously changed his mind a bit. He might not have articulated this, but, once Alan Brooke rose in the hierarchy, his patronage was quite key to officers getting into high positions. And so it seems likely, I think, that Alan Brooke, perhaps, if not completely re-evaluating Alexander based on his performance in 1940, which was pretty good. He was eventually promoted to 1 corps and left in command of the land portion of the Dunkirk evacuation. I think it certainly convinced Alan Brooke to some extent that he was, he did have something about him and some kind of leadership quality, even if it maybe wasn't the kind of the sort of academic, the brains that he was looking for at Staff College. And
he was actually, when you say it's Dunkirk, the film, isn't it, with Kevin Branagh, isn't it, going up and down the beach? Is there anyone there? But that was actually, Alexander was the last man off the beach going up and down, asking if there's anyone there.
Yeah, he went up and down in a boat with a megaphone shouting, is there anyone there? He'd been sort of left once the BEF leadership and Lord Gort and their headquarters had to evacuate. They left the newly promoted Alexander in charge, who'd taken over 1 corps from Michael Barker, who was sort of deemed to not be up to it. And if you believe Montgomery's account, which is, it's Montgomery's account, so who knows? But he would later write that he was friends with Gort, and he wrote that it was him who recommended Alexander take over from Barker because he'd sort of proven himself capable. I don't know whether that's Montgomery imagining he had more influence with Gort or not, but Alexander's performance during this stage did, impress a lot of these people who he would encounter later on.
Is he Southern Command is his next posting, but what seems like then a big leap is he's sent to Burma to hold Rangoon as the Japanese are attacking, which seems like a big jump.
Well, by the time he gets there, he's to retake Rangoon or to save Rangoon. I'm not sure exactly. I suppose he's proven himself, calm in a crisis. At Dunkirk, he sort of has this kind of ability, which it's unclear entirely whether it's real or an act. That he sort of is always very calm in a crisis. He's very unruffled. So he had this kind of reputation. He'd come to Churchill's sort of attention through the Dunkirk evacuation, and he'd also there had to make some quite difficult decisions dealing with the French admiral who was in charge of the French component. And he'd sort of proven himself able to be quite ruthless, I think, in dealing with allies when he had to be. And so he was sent to Burma, I suppose, on the basis of this reputation for being able to deal with a crisis and manage it. And he did sort of try to retake Rangoon briefly. He felt compelled to, those were his orders, but it was basically impossible and it didn't work. And so he then basically took the decision to evacuate the remaining British and Imperial forces to India, which he did in a bit of a scrape, but he managed to come out of it pretty much as the only person involved with his reputation enhanced rather than damaged.
Which says something about, it's a failure of a campaign, but somehow he comes away unscathed.
This sort of, reputation for being, calm and able to make quick decisions in a crisis, I think, again, that is what he came out with.
From there, he's sent to the Middle East. I assume that's on the back of him suddenly being this rising star and the Middle East's in trouble, and he's replacing Auchinleck. What's interesting about that is you get now the pairing with Monty. So he arrives as Commander-in-Chief Middle East Command with Monty as the 8th Army Commander. What's that relationship like? Monty's notoriously spiky, but I can't help but feel they make their relationship work. I was going to say they seem to get on, but maybe they make their relationship work might be a better way of putting it.
Well, it's interesting because for all that Montgomery later criticised Alexander, because he criticised everyone, they do seem to have got on. He said that he considered Alexander to be a friend and said that he was, the best chief he could have had. Alexander's role, I suppose, really was as Commander-in-Chief Middle East to kind of almost shield Montgomery from Churchill's harrying. His predecessors, Wavell and Auchinleck, had both had to sort of, been forced or pressured into launching premature offensives by Churchill, who wanted action now. And Montgomery was basically, he's a meticulous planner. That's his method. And so Alexander was able to, perhaps due to the favour he'd found with Churchill, kind of soothe the Prime Minister as during the apparent inactivity while the 8th Army kind of retrained and re-equipped before the Battle of Alamein, the Second Battle of Alamein, that is. He did kind of work well with Montgomery at this point. He obviously recognised Montgomery's skill and allowed him quite a lot of latitude. He wasn't one for interfering with subordinates who he trusted to get the job done unless he thought it was necessary. And there is an episode during the Second Battle of Alamein, during Operation Supercharge, which is the sort of second phase of the battle, where it may be, it's always been a bit unclear whether Alexander was behind it, but essentially the Montgomery wanted to attack, I think, in the north, where the German and Italian opposition was stronger, and then he changed his mind and attacked to the south instead, or on the southern part of the line. And whether or not this decision came from Alexander, it's been suggested by his ADC suggested it was him, but then he would do, because to every ADC, their general is the greatest general, and it must, they want to make them sound good. It might have come from him, it might have come from Dick McCreary, who was his chief of staff, but it certainly, I think, fits with Alexander's way of doing things, which is this kind of subtle suggestion. He's not one for giving orders to trusted subordinates if he doesn't have to. It's more, he had this method of command by persuasion. If he thought something wasn't right, he'd sort of subtly suggest it in such a way as to make the subordinate think that they'd come up with it themselves, which I think in Montgomery's case is probably the way to do things, because he was, as you say, quite prickly, and he had this idea of the Monty master plan and not diverting from the plan. So to convince him he'd come up with it by himself was perhaps the only way to do it.
I'm intrigued by how does he manage to keep Churchill off Montgomery's back? Because Churchill was a dreadful interferer. How does he manage to resist or get away with Churchill not basically firing him or colluding to have him fired for resisting Churchill's demands to attack now? Do they have a pre-existing relationship?
As I said, he'd come to Churchill's attention earlier on in the war, and by this point he was sort of, if not yet, he was working towards, well, not consciously, but becoming Churchill's favourite. It's often said that he was Churchill's favourite, and I think it seems pretty likely that he was. Churchill's Dr. Lord Moran wrote in his diary that, he can't say no to Alex and gives him whatever he wants. And this was slightly later on, but this was a kind of fledgling relationship at this time. And it's interesting. Well, as I say, Lord Moran commented on this in his diary, and I think he's quite right to observe that Alexander appealed to Churchill's sort of romanticism and sense of what war could be and should be. For Churchill, war was an adventure. He had this formative experience in the Boer War and as a correspondent and, escaping from prison camps and stuff. And I think he disliked the kind of brutality and machinery of modern war. And Alexander, being sort of every inch the gentleman and being quite sort of calm and well-mannered, really appealed to Churchill. And he, I think, saw something in him that his other generals were lacking that made war seem a little bit more gentlemanly. And so I suppose that gave him a degree of influence. He wasn't entirely free from Churchill's sort of being harassed by Churchill. And later on in Italy, for instance, Churchill would rant about Alex's lack of progress in meetings with the chiefs of staff when things were going badly. But on the whole, he was quite often soothed by having spoken to Alexander. He obviously, saw something in him that not everyone else did.
Yeah, I just got that relation. Alex must have had some sort of relationship with that allowed Churchill to have some sort of trust in him. So when he's defying him, he can somehow get away with it. So when the Americans enter the war, we start to have obviously the British and Commonwealth forces are already a multinational force, but when the Americans arrive in the Mediterranean, we get Eisenhower being brought in as is he Commander-in-Chief Allied Forces HQ, with Alex in charge of the British 18th Army Group. So this would be Alex's sort of first interactions with the Americans, with Eisenhower sort of, I guess, above him. How does that command structure function with Eisenhower? Do they have a good relationship?
Well, just quickly on the first point, he had previously worked alongside Joseph Stilwell in Burma, which I think was his first interaction with the Americans. But the command relationship is different there. They're more sort of partners rather than within the kind of hierarchy. His relationship with Eisenhower, I think, was pretty good. Initially, I think Eisenhower found it quite daunting. Before Operation Torch had been launched, Alexander had initially been earmarked to command what became the British First Army, which would have been under Eisenhower, before he was then transferred to the Middle East. And so they first met at that point, and I think Eisenhower was initially quite daunted that the most experienced battlefield commander in the British Empire, who was senior to him, was going to be his subordinate. But Alex was very kind of confident, and, he sort of assured Eisenhower that they would work well together, and they seem to have got along quite well. But the relationship he had in terms of the command hierarchy is quite interesting. He became deputy commander-in-chief largely at the instigation of the British chiefs of staff, because Eisenhower, for all that his great skills at managing a coalition and the political side of things, hadn't really excelled commanding forces in the field. The British way of doing things historically had been to have committee command. So in the Middle East, they'd had an air, land, and sea commander who would sort of work together. The Americans were dead against that. They wanted unity of command because it enables quicker decisions and you don't get the kind of bickering. So Eisenhower was to be in charge. The British kind of almost inserted a committee underneath, although it didn't work in the same way. They were all answerable to Eisenhower, but you had Tedder as the air commander, Cunningham, the naval commander, Alex, the ground commander. But despite him being deputy, that didn't really in practice translate into much. It was more a sort of a title, but Eisenhower himself would later write that the role of the deputy at that point didn't really amount to much. The aim of putting Alexander in there was, in the words of Alan Brooke, to push Eisenhower into the stratosphere of supreme command. So he could deal with, this big strategic picture. Alexander was to take over the 18th Army Group, which basically gave him command of all British, French, and American ground forces in Tunisia. So the First Army, the 8th Army, US 2 Corps, and French 19 Corps, which was, I think, part of the First Army. But his role was sort of strictly limited to command of those troops engaged against the Germans. So Eisenhower had control of the reserves and everything. So he was, again, a battlefield commander. the sort of the senior battlefield commander. His responsibility was the battle in Tunisia and managing that. It's in some ways his victory in Tunisia, and that's why he later was ennobled as the Earl of Tunis. It sort of has his sort of signature two-fisted punch, if you like, using the Eighth Army from coming up from the south to knock the Axis forces off balance, and then the First Army coming from the west to deal the killing blow.
Yes, yeah. I never thought of it like that before. Sicily's an interesting one from his point of view, because under him at Sicily he has Patton and Monty, which I wonder then, when it comes to the planning of the Sicily invasion, how territorial is Alex? Does he have a national bias? Because I can't help but feel that he kind of lets Sicily be Monty's show, or at least in the planning.
Yeah, I think the Sicily planning's all a bit of a mess, and it's largely Monty's kind of almost creating a crisis where he can convince everyone that his plan is the way to resolve it. So Alexander had been tasked with sort of planning the invasion of Sicily to some extent, and had this headquarters that he was in charge of, but was absent from, because this was all going on while the battle in Tunisia was still happening. So the initial plan was drawn up by this headquarters that was nominally under Alexander's command. But as you say, Monty ended up coming up with an alternative and sort of getting his way, much to the annoyance of the naval and air commanders, who favoured the kind of dispersed landings plan, because that would enable them to, get as many airfields as possible, which was always the priority of the air commanders. Monty wanted a kind of concentrated attack on the southeast of the island, believing that, if we're going to potentially face strong opposition, we need to be able to be mutually supporting and have all of our effort concentrated on one point. That Alexander supported Montgomery in this debate, I think, shows more than anything how much he trusted Montgomery as a subordinate. He'd very much in Tunisia let Montgomery kind of do his own thing to some extent, whilst managing Anderson's First Army, who had a more difficult start to the campaign. And so he definitely trusted Montgomery. It's, as I said, he letting his sort of subordinate army commanders get on with it unless he felt there was something important. But perhaps in doing so, in letting Montgomery or supporting Montgomery in this kind of planning debate, he did perhaps contribute inadvertently to alienating some of the other commanders involved, who were quite annoyed by this incident. But it has to be said also that Eisenhower doesn't come out of this spectacularly either, because he sort of didn't particularly weigh in as the commander-in-chief, and in future sort of amphibious operations, the planning would be the preserve of the commander-in-chief, or supreme commander as he became. So this kind of everybody getting a say in the planning and then Montgomery winning was all a bit of a mess, really, that Montgomery perhaps instigated. But I think Alex trusted him and saw the merits of his plan and felt compelled to go with that. The
problem with his plan was that it was how the British were going to capture Sicily, while the Americans under Patton were kind of going to sort of hold a separate line and sort of be sort of more of a defensive action for them, while the British romped up the East Coast? Now, this is obviously not to Patton's liking, and he starts to kick up a fuss, presumably through his own chain of command, through his American chain of command. How does Alex go about de-escalating that to keep everybody happy?
Well, it has to be said that the initial plan, I think, did make military sense. And at this point, I think Alexander was still kind of having to learn that making decisions on a strictly military basis was no longer always viable in an alliance with the Americans. You have to sort of consider the kind of diplomatic aspect of that. And, he had quite a poor opinion of American troops since the early days in Tunisia. He took over just after the American debacle at Kasserine, which had sort of affected his view of them as soldiers. And in his eyes, they were yet to prove themselves. But it did make sense to give the experienced 8th Army the leading role, and the 7th Army a kind of subsidiary role. Having said that, when the campaign was underway, Alexander wasn't on the island. He thought it would be wrong to sort of, ship over his headquarters when the troops were still short of trucks and stuff. So he was, again, at a distance, which it affected his ability to kind of control his subordinates. But Patton, I think, as you say, was a bit frustrated at this, as were many of his staff. a couple of incidents kind of heightened this. There was Montgomery sort of convincing Alexander to let him take over a road that had been assigned to Omar Bradley's corps, which was seen as sort of seen by the Americans as infringing on their territory and sort of, prioritizing Eighth Army over their advance, which again, as a military decision, made sense. But the sort of repercussions for inter-allied relations were not necessarily given the consideration they should have been. In the end, Patton ended up basically going to Alexander to meet him personally and put this kind of to him that, Seventh Army could take on a bigger role. And Alexander, I think, had already been considering this at this point. The Eighth Army advance was sort of slow and, they were facing strong German opposition and there was all sorts of problems they had to deal with malaria and stuff. And the Seventh Army was, a very mobile, well-equipped and motivated force. And he gave Patton permission to, go off to take Palermo, which, again, as a military objective, it wasn't really necessary. But it gave the Americans a kind of a victory, which was important for their kind of confidence and the feeling that they weren't, just a kind of subordinate army to the Eighth Army. But also it sort of showed the Americans' ability to carry out these kind of fast-moving maneuvers, and Patton in particular. After that point, it was sort of natural to let the Americans take Messina or, give them permission to advance on this. They got there first. I think Alexander was perfectly open to this. He wasn't sort of wedded to the idea of the British having the victory as Patton might have imagined. Again, the plan, as it evolved, it made military sense to give the Americans a bigger role. But they were still in this kind of learning phase. And so perhaps the way Alexander went about managing the Americans and the British and their sort of inter-allied squabbles, this was still a learning curve that was going on. What's
interesting is then that Monty's quite critical of Alex, basically saying he lacks grip and the whole campaign lacked direction. Yet it's Monty's plan. You can't feel that's a criticism from Monty because he feels slighted because the Americans were allowed to let rip up the West.
I'm not sure about that. I think Montgomery was less bothered than I think Patton would have imagined by this. I think a lot of this supposed race to Messina was very much a figment of Patton's imagination. I think it's fair to say that perhaps Alexander could have exercised more grit, but as I say, he wasn't present at the start of the campaign for perfectly logical reasons. And again, he had two sort of trusted army commanders who he was content to kind of let get on with the job. Perhaps another factor in this that may have changed things, I don't know, is to do with Alexander's style of command. He was accused by some contemporaries of being overly reliant on others for ideas, and I don't think that's necessarily true. I think he could come up with ideas. I think what he struggled with sometimes was to put those ideas into writing and into action. And so he had really excelled in Tunisia with Richard McCreary as his chief of staff, who was incredibly able and worked well as a team with Alex in this respect. But the chief of staff he had in Sicily was a guy called Alec Richardson, was not of the same caliber as McCreary. And I wonder whether perhaps this kind of lack of support from, or not lack of support, but rather the departure of his sort of able chief of staff and this kind of effective team they had perhaps affected his ability to realize his, ideas. But as I say, it might well also be that he was content to let Monty and Patton get on with it because they were both very capable commanders, and it was a victory. It's often sort of criticized for slow progress and letting the Germans escape, but they did conquer or liberate Sicily and defeat the German and Italian forces there. Maybe it took slightly longer than some people think it should have done, but I don't think that can necessarily be attributed to Alexander.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a moment. Now, the commander structure in the Mediterranean changes again once Eisenhower's moved off to start thinking about D-Day. And in comes Henry Maitland Wilson, Jumbo Wilson, to replace Eisenhower. What's interesting about that is you now have two Brits with the top job, which seems to unbalance the command perhaps in the Mediterranean. We also see Patton go and Clark comes in, and Patton's obviously he's fired for the slapping incident, isn't he? And Mark Clark comes in.
Sort of given a bit of a timeout on the naughty step.
Timeout. That's a very good way of putting it. How does the equilibrium of command sort of work out with Wilson and Alex? Is Alex still what's Alex's role when Wilson comes in? He's no longer just the Army Group Commander, or that shift?
At the start of 1944, Wilson comes in as the Commander-in-Chief, later to become the Supreme Allied Commander in the Mediterranean. Alex is still commanding what is now 15th Army Group. But in the months that follow, it changes its name a couple of times. It becomes the Allied Central Mediterranean Force and then the Allied armies in Italy. But its responsibilities grow as well. It takes on greater administrative responsibilities. And whereas in Tunisia and Sicily he had been in command of only those forces engaged with the enemy, increasingly he's given control of all ground forces within Italy and Sicily. So it really is taking on more responsibility than was normal for an army group. And this, I think, to some extent caused a bit of an issue where AFHQ and the Allied armies in Italy's responsibilities started to overlap or impinge on each other. And Jumbo Wilson also perhaps made matters a bit more difficult in that Eisenhower had been quite content to take a kind of hands-off approach and operate in what I mentioned before Alan Brooke described as the stratosphere of Supreme Command. Wilson was much more hands-on. It was within his remit to manage the battles in Italy, but he made sure that his Chief of Staff, James Gamble, was present at all the Allied armies in Italy planning conferences, and this really, I think, wound up Alexander and his staff and, other army commanders in Italy like Oliver Leese. They really disliked Gamble's presence there. They saw it as interfering. Wilson, I think, commented on this in a letter to Alan Brooke and said that he had the feeling that Alex resents me and this sort of thing, but that I'm just, doing what I think I ought to be doing. So there is this kind of two-tier command setup where increasingly as both headquarters have expanded and you've got this new commander at the top, there's a bit more friction going on between the two, with sort of Alexander, I think, seeing Italy as his responsibility, whereas Wilson's got the whole Mediterranean. But of course, Italy is where the focus of the operations in the Mediterranean is for the first half of 1944. And so there is a bit of a kind of change in the dynamic there between the two headquarters.
It's in Italy as well. We start to see British and American, American commanders commanding British troops, and I presume vice versa. And I was actually thinking, I was thinking about those Anzio landings where it becomes a problem where Lucas is commanding the British Infantry Division and the 3rd US Infantry Division. That falls under Mark Clark. And then Anzio becomes stuck, not rather unstuck, becomes stuck at the beaches. How much of this is an Allied coalition problem? Why is Alex not sort of directly intervening?
The sort of debates around Anzio kind of go around in circles, and Lucas was made into a bit of a scapegoat, although I think it's fair that he got his share of the blame for it. But the initial problem was that each commander down the chain seemed to have a slightly different idea about what the landings would try to achieve. Alexander wanted, I think, a kind of quick kind of push inland to try and threaten the German rear and, force the main German defensive line to fall back. Mark Clark,
but that was the plan, though, wasn't it? Because they're stuck at the Gustav line. They're trying to outflank it.
The problem is, I think, as you say, Lucas was under Clark, who had a slightly different idea of what was going on, and had told Lucas, based on his own experience of the landings at Salerno, which had been, very difficult and nearly not too far from disaster at one point. He told Lucas, don't stick your neck out. I did at Salerno and it didn't do me any good. So Alexander's envisaging this kind of quick push inland, which may or may not have been possible with the forces they had. It might have been too small a force, but that's endlessly debated. But Lucas errs on the side of caution. And that kind of, enables the Germans to kind of quickly react and encircle them on the beaches. The coalition problem they face really is that there's a supply issue. The kind of you've got American and British troops mixed up again, which they've tried to avoid since Tunisia because they've got different kit, and that causes all sorts of problems. But then the big problem is what to do with Lucas, because Alex had been involved in the sacking of 2 US corps commanders so far. There was Friedendahl in Tunisia, who was sacked by Eisenhower, he was utterly useless. And Alex kind of observed this and had, said to Eisenhower, is this the best you've got? But it was Eisenhower that made the decision. And with Ernest Dawley at Salerno, who was Lucas's predecessor as commander of 6th Corps, something similar had happened where Alex had kind of, talked to Clark about it, but Eisenhower had made the decision. Eisenhower was no longer in the theatre, and they wanted Lucas to go. Alexander, however, recognized that as a British commander, to sack an American general could cause a problem. He'd really, I think the experiences of Tunisia and Sicily had kind of taught him that dealing with allies was a sort of prickly business, and you've got to be very careful not to do anything that could be perceived as a slight. And so sacking Lucas could cause all sorts of problems. So he tried to persuade Mark Clark, who was Lucas's superior, to do it. He was the army commander, and Clark wouldn't do it because he was worried that Lucas had been previously senior to him before the war, and he was kind of felt uncomfortable with this. And eventually Alex told Clark, I want you to get rid of him now, or you'll go as well. And I think this is a real kind of rebuttal to the historians who've said that Alexander lacked firmness and didn't deal strongly enough with subordinates, because he basically said to Clark, look, if you don't do this, you'll go as well. In the event, what ended up happening was they ended up having to consult Eisenhower, who was by now in Northwest Europe, but had basically all these US corps commanders lined up and ready to go who might be potential replacements. George Marshall in Washington, the American chief of the army staff, was involved, and Jake Devers, who was the new deputy commander-in-chief in the Mediterranean. And eventually they did sort of sideline Lucas, and Lucien Truscott, who was the divisional commander under him, took over. But even then it was a kind of slow process, because to sack a commander in the middle of a battle is a difficult business. And to sort of save face a bit, they initially promoted Truscott to be Lucas's deputy to start with, and he sort of gradually took over and revitalized things in the Anzio bridgehead.
It's a good example of how much politics interferes with actual day-to-day practicalities when it comes to a multinational force.
I've seen it written before that, about the sort of early stages of the Italian campaign, but it's incredible that only now did Alexander really get the nuances of coalition warfare. And I think that's really the wrong way to look at it. I think you could look at it as they've gone through this learning process. This is all, the collaboration between Britain and America is unprecedented, really. And so I don't think it's surprising that it perhaps took some of them a while to get this. I think it's worth noting that Alexander did get it. He did learn in a way that lots of others didn't. And I think this is a good example of that.
The Anzio breakout, obviously Mark Clark heads to Rome, which is not what he's meant to be doing. The Germans run the run. He could cut off the German 10th Army as it withdraws. He heads to Rome, which is counter to Alex's orders. Even Clark's subordinate Truscott is slightly incredulous that Mark Clark's doing his own thing. So how does that fit into coalition command? Can Alex not fire him for directly not doing as he was told? It basically, is Clark reassured that he's in a safe position because of the hoo-ha to get rid of Lucas?
Well, to start with, I think that whether or not the decision was the right one or not is endlessly debated. And there is a case to be made that Clark's decision was the right one in the moment. I'm not sure about that, but in terms of Alexander sort of sacking him, there's this kind of oft-repeated account that Alexander was really angry at Clark for this, which seems quite out of character and seems to be sort of slightly murky in terms of where that account came from. So it may or may not be the case that he was annoyed at Clark. But within Alexander's way of operating, as I say, he gave army commanders a lot of latitude to make decisions on the spot. And so it may well be that Clark was doing what Alexander saw as he was well within his right to make that decision. If Alexander was angry with him, which, as I say, is a contentious thing, I think he probably couldn't have sacked him anyway if he'd wanted to, because, as you say, he was an American, but also he just liberated Rome. And that's a big, big win in the eyes of sort of the US public. And, to sack the general who's just liberated the first sort of capital city in Europe to be freed from the Nazis would be a controversial thing to do at best. I suspect really that this didn't irreparably damage the relationship between Alex and Clark. If as some have said, Alex was not happy with this decision, because he ended up sort of, soon after, Alex was sort of recommending Clark to sort of take over. When he ended up getting promoted to Supreme Commander at the end of the year, Clark would take over the army group, and Alexander was perfectly happy to suggest that. So I do think that from a sort of Allied perspective, there was no real possibility of Alexander having to sack Clark. Whether he could have done in the event, I think, would be complicated more by the fact that Clark had just won a fairly significant victory in the eyes of the American people, perhaps as much as the recriminations surrounding Lucas's sacking earlier on.
Yeah, Mark Clark had perhaps won the PR war, which anything else might not have done so much. Now, you mentioned there Alex is finally bumped up to Supreme Commander. It feels like he's had an apprenticeship getting there with all the jobs in between, which perhaps Eisenhower doesn't have when he had the role. Is this an expanded role that he has when he finally gets there, when Alex takes over from Wilson? How does he handle operating in Alan Brooks' stratosphere of Supreme Commander?
The issue of promoting Alexander to Supreme Commander is quite contentious. The British Chiefs of Staff are not that keen on it. They'd previously sort of argued strongly against him being promoted when Wilson took over, because to some, Alexander was the deputy at the time. He was seen as the sort of natural successor. But I think there was a real question around whether Alexander was right for this. And it's often framed, people take quotes from the diaries of the Chiefs of Staff on this, Alan Brooks saying he's just too stupid for the role. He's not a big enough man. Admiral Cunningham, the first Sea Lord, who's really, dead against the idea, he strongly argues against this. Cunningham's slightly different because he'd fallen out with Alex during the invasion of Italy earlier on, and they seem to have sort of held this kind of grudge, or he seems to have held this grudge going forward. With Alan Brooks' criticism, I think to some extent it's sort of misread. I think that he perhaps is right to point out that Alexander is not necessarily qualified for this role that is essentially in this stratosphere. He's, it's largely political. It's a bit of a desk job. Alexander has had a sort of a staff role for maybe 2 years in his career in the early 1930s, at which point he really sort of demonstrated what even his most ardent admirers have described as a laziness towards paperwork. And this had served him quite well, actually. As a battlefield commander, he was able to delegate quite well, and his chiefs of staff, McCreary and John Harding in Italy, really praised this kind of, he was only interested in the important details. He let us do our job and he did his. And this is kind of, part of this teamwork dynamic I mentioned earlier, with him and the chief of staff, McCreary, and then Harding worked quite well together in that sense. But suddenly he was being put in this position where his responsibilities were for the whole of the Mediterranean. There's Greece and Yugoslavia to deal with, and there's problems there. There's the continuing battle in Italy, which he wanted to retain command of. And so there were changes in the command at this time where what had been the AAI, the Allied armies in Italy, as I mentioned, with these kind of overlapping responsibilities, was reduced and renamed 15th Army Group and became a more conventional army group under Mark Clark's leadership, where it was to, direct the armies, and the other responsibilities were moved to AFHQ. This was what Churchill wanted to sort of reduce what he saw as the bloated commands, and Alexander wanted it too, from experience. But what they both envisaged was a more radical change, whereby Alex would essentially still control the battles, almost acting as commander of the AAI as well as the Supreme Commander. Churchill had wanted this largely for political reasons. He wanted the British to control the Mediterranean. Alex had kind of wanted it perhaps because he'd always kind of seen things maybe in a bit of an Italian bubble, if you like, as a lot of the commanders in Italy did. His broader view of global strategy was perhaps coloured by his time in Italy and the sort of fact that he believed, or seemed to believe, he could, if given the resources, achieve more substantial results in Italy. As it happened, when he was promoted, he did kind of inevitably lose grip on the battles in Italy and had to sort of give Mark Clark the responsibility for dealing with that, and who's dealing with now two very able army commanders as well, in Alex's former chief of staff, Richard McCreary, now commanding the 8th Army, and Truscott, who we mentioned from Anzio, now commanding the 5th Army. Alex's responsibilities pretty much focused elsewhere, on Greece initially, where there was a big problem arising with the communist-led resistance group Hellas. Street fighting had broken out between them and British and Greek government forces over their the issue of them being disarmed and participating in government. And so Alex had to quickly go over and resolve this crisis, which was his first political test, if you like, and was very ably assisted in this by the British resident minister in the Mediterranean, Harold Macmillan, who would go on to be prime minister in the 1950s. So the role really was different once he was promoted, and it perhaps took him a short while to realise that really he was now operating in this political stratosphere that was increasingly divorced from the battlefield in Italy, which he'd been in charge of for, at this point, over a year.
Well, that close in 45 is a different type of war. The war, people are starting to manoeuvre for the end of the war rather than just winning the war. They're going to win the war, that's for sure, but when is different. But so you have different political machinations as people sort of shuffle around. He has to deal with the Trieste crisis as well, doesn't he? Which is the possibility of Tito expanding Yugoslavia, doing a land grab.
One of the big problems he has to deal with at this level, which I think he hadn't perhaps previously appreciated, he'd really almost perfected the art of brushing over national differences within the Allied armies in Italy by dealing with the commanders face to face and having a good relationship with them. And this had enabled him to command this force of 26 plus nationalities in a way that maybe nobody else could have done. But operating as the supreme commander, you're suddenly having to deal with this layer above where the British and American governments, they have their own objectives and their own policies. They can't be soothed over by just chatting to them. And Alexander is not really able to make policy. He has to implement policy as he's given it. And so with the British and Americans increasingly thinking of post-war matters, and the British particularly having a strong idea of securing their position in the Mediterranean against Soviet expansion, the Americans have quite different take on this, particularly the US State Department and the military, who are very much against assisting the British in what they see as a kind of imperialist action in Greece to impose a government on the Greeks. And Alexander's in this quite difficult position, therefore he's got to, manage this operation with the British troops operating in Greece and keep them supplied and equipped and reach a political solution without American support. And so in this instance, he basically does revert to being a British commander, which in some ways he is. He's a British theatre commander as well as the Supreme Allied Commander. And whereas Wilson had been really tried to be as neutral as possible, which perhaps was his downfall in some respect, it really angered Churchill, his apparent lack of fight over the issue of the landings in southern France, which the Americans wanted, and Wilson wasn't seen to have opposed strongly enough. Alexander takes the opposite approach, and in the absence of an agreement between the British and Americans at this highest level, he tends to lean back on the British view, which is I suppose logical when he's being advised by Harold Macmillan primarily.
In that role with Mark Clark almost as his number two, as the army commander in Italy, how much of an effective team did they make? Mark Clark is supposedly notoriously Anglophobic. Are they singing from the same hymn sheet in those closing months of the war?
Well, in the closing battles, it's interesting because the original plan that formed the basis of what would be Operation Grapeshot, which is the final offensive in Italy that brought about the German surrender, that came from Alex's headquarters, the AAI, before his promotion. That was drawn up in 1944 and then enacted in 1945 under Clark's leadership. And Clark, I think, had this perhaps retained some of his fixation with geographical objectives. There's, famously people will say over, as the incident we discussed with the casino battles, his fixation on Rome. But that's not necessarily unique to Clark in the sense that I think it was quite a common thing among US commanders, particularly to prioritize geographical objectives. And so he perhaps was a little bit fixated on Bologna at this point. Alex trusted Clark to kind of to put this plan into action and to lead these battles. But I think, as I mentioned, the two army commanders working together to some extent it was their victory as much as Clark's. Clark's Anglophobia tended to particularly take the form of a bias against the Eighth Army, which was sort of circumvented to some extent by agreement between Truscott and McCreary. And so Alexander, as I said, was sort of almost divorced from this, but the team he'd left in place was incredibly able. He'd sort of requested Truscott personally from Eisenhower's command in Northwest Europe to take over from Clark, and he, I think, knew that these guys were a trustworthy team who could bring about victory in Italy, which they then did. And Alexander was, at this point, sort of more concerned, I think, with bringing about the German surrender, and saw that as kind of his priority, particularly as after he was made aware of the OSS approach to Karl Wolff and this kind of really murky business, which in the end did bring about the surrender in Italy after quite a long time, really. It didn't quite fizzle out, but the Germans in Italy did surrender first. It was the first front to kind of fall. That's, I think, largely due to the success of the team Alexander had led in Italy and kind of left in place after his appointment to the Supreme Command in the Mediterranean.
I do wonder what Mark Clark and Alexander's personal relationship was like. Are they sending each other cheery Christmas cards after the war? Is it that much of a personal relationship? I can almost see it happening with Alex and Monty, as spiky as Monty could be. But
well, I think Clark, in his memoir, is quite sort of, he sort of talks about Alex being, a good chief, and I'm sure they had their disagreements over certain things, but they do seem to have, on the whole, worked quite well together. But it is interesting that in Alexander's memoir, which he didn't really write, he kind of was ghostwritten for him, but he sort of provided notes and comments on it. Clark barely gets mentioned at all, which is interesting because Patton gets a whole section dedicated to him, and he commanded him for much less time than Clark. But I don't think that's necessarily a comment on their personal relationship, and I think their working relationship did turn out quite well in the end. They both sort of understood each other and how each other operated, and Alexander was content to recommend Clark to command the 15th Army Group at the end of 1944.
I have one last question. When we reflect back on Alexander, as a supreme commander, I wondered if he'd been promoted sort of one level above his ceiling. My justification being he is much more of a battlefield commander. Monty does accuse him, which we touched upon, of lacking kind of direction and letting other people come up with ideas for him. Was he promoted slightly too far? That's not to say he wasn't good at the job, but
I think it's probably safe to say that he was promoted at Churchill's instigation. Churchill, as I mentioned, Alex was his favourite, but also more importantly at this point, I think as Churchill became dissatisfied with Wilson, Alexander's views seemed to chime more with what Churchill wanted, which was a British-led theatre in the Mediterranean where the armies in Italy, which were predominantly, the majority British or Empire, or at least British equipped in the case of units like the Poles, he wanted, for sort of, I suppose, reasons of British prestige, he wanted a British victory, and Italy was the place he saw that it could be done, and he wanted to, secure the British position, whereas, as I mentioned, Wilson had been very neutral. He wanted someone who would prioritise British interests. And I think Alexander kind of aligned with Churchill on this to some extent, but not necessarily for the same reasons. Alexander, I think, saw that he believed militarily that his multinational force in Italy could do something significant if they were given the resources. This is perhaps the offensive he envisaged to take Vienna across the Alps. Move across the Alps and take Vienna does seem a little bit far-fetched. But lots of the Mediterranean commanders were drawn into this idea after the victory at Cassino, which was the biggest victory the Western Allies had won at this point. It seemed possible. I think Alexander was a battlefield commander. His attempt to kind of cling on to being a battlefield commander, I think, is significant. And he seems to have quite enjoyed a supreme commander running around Greece and, driving around in an armored car, getting shot at by snipers. It felt more natural to him than the dealing with the political level. But I think he was quite, ably advised. He had a good chief of staff. He had Macmillan with him. And I think that perhaps the chiefs of staff were... Alan Brooke, I think, perhaps was onto something. I think it's wrong to say Alexander was in any way stupid. I think that's clearly not true. I mean, he taught himself multiple Indian languages during his time there in the 30s, which doesn't strike me as the sort of thing a stupid person might be able to do. But I think that perhaps Alan Brooke recognized where Alexander's talents lay, and his understanding of the bigger strategic picture and the dealing with the sort of British and American governments, I think, was not something he was used to, and it did take some getting used to. And his initial kind of attempts to reorganize the commands in Italy, perhaps unbalancing the Anglo-American integrated way of doing things that had been established under Eisenhower, I think demonstrate that his sort of at this top level, he was perhaps, if not a bit out of his depth, he had more learning to do. It was very different from what he'd been doing for pretty much the whole war, which was commanding troops at every level, from division to army group.
Yeah, and the Supreme Commander becomes much more of a political role, really, which I think Eisenhower's perhaps more naturally suited to.
Yeah, I think so. I think Alexander's ability to smooth over the problems between allies on a face-to-face basis really worked with the AAI, the Allied armies in Italy. But at that higher level, the British and American governments could not be reconciled by force of personality. I think that this was a challenge for him in a way that maybe he hadn't felt commanding the army group in Tunisia, for instance.
Fantastic. Thanks, Matthew. I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the prep for it. Loyal listener, that is it for this episode. Next time, I'll be joined by Taylor Downing to discuss photo reconnaissance. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.